I'm Johan Rashivega in Holyoke Media in our studios here in One Court Plaza in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And I am with Jorge Sosa, composer, Mexican composer who is part of the cycle of victory players titled Si Se Puede. Yes, we can. Jorge, welcome. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm just delighted to be here, and it's been a great experience working with the Victory Players, with Tian Wei Eng, my dear friend, and it's just been a tremendous experience.
Your piece is titled Rocola, which could be translated as the jukebox. And even for some younger people, that sounds a little bit like, what exactly is that? So let's hear a little bit about what a rocola is and why it is so important as the axis of your piece for this cycle of Si Se Puede.
Yeah, so when the opportunity to write this piece came about, I was starting to think about some ideas and what I wanted to say with this music, and I started writing really, and since it was going to be a project about Mexican American artists and Mexican American composers, I really wanted to write something that was representative of my culture. And so I started writing with some forms of folk music, of traditional Mexican music in mind. Very concretely, the first movement, which is titled Canción de Cantina, or a cantina song. It's about the rancheras that I would sing with my grandfather and my dad. We would get together on Saturdays and Sundays and we'd play the guitar and we would sing these beautiful songs by Cuco Sánchez, Jose Alfredo Jimenez, just tremendous, and boleros also. And so that was sort of the genesis, and then I started to think about being in a cantina in Mexico City, downtown Mexico City, and having the jukebox. And the jukebox is kind of like an analog Spotify, if you would. Yeah, so you would have all these recordings, and you can choose the song that you wanted. And sometimes there would be other people, and you would have sort of a duel to see who would play the songs that they wanted. And other times maybe you would come into community and everybody would start singing. And the rocolas that I remember from the sort of late 90s into the 2000s in Mexico, and they're still in many cantinas, they would have a vast collection of Mexican music, mostly Mexican music. And you could hear sort of rancheras from the 30s, from the 40s, or mambos, or salsas, a lot of Cuban music, cumbias, and even some rock music. So it just kind of had like a little mini history of music there. So I thought that I would take that as a point of departure for rocola. So like I said, the first movement is the Canción de Cantina, very much based on the rancheras, that type of music. The second movement is a cumbia, and cumbia, which is not really, or it's not indigenous to Mexico. It's actually a Colombian genre. But in the 80s and into the 90s and the 2000s, cumbia became really sort of a dominant genre in Mexican music, and a lot of Mexican groups started to adapt these rhythms. Coming from Colombia, from migrants coming into Mexico from Colombia, escaping the drug wars, some of them, or escaping violence, others just maybe touring or whatever. And but growing up, whenever you went to a party in El Barrio, there was a cumbia playing. And the other really important thing that happened in the early 2000s, late 90s, is that suddenly we began to hear about cumbias in Spanish that were coming from the United States. Very concretely, Selena. Selena, who is just a seminal figure of Mexican American music. So now it's Mexican music that is coming from the United States into Mexico. And that was really sort of a very important connection. And that feedback loop that is just becoming, sort of gaining momentum and becoming more and more important. And then the third movement is called ska. And again, ska is not a genre that originates in Mexico. It's actually more Caribbean, Jamaican, but it became a really important style in the 90s and in the sort of rock movements in the 90s and 2000s that were very social conscious movements, because we were fighting for a democratic openness in Mexico after 70 years of the single party rule, and the Zapatista movement that was fighting for rights of indigenous peoples. And the backdrop, the musical backdrop of this was ska, I mean, Mexican rock, or rock en tu idioma that we used to call it too. And so a lot of bands like Café Tacuba, Maldita Vecindad, Tijuana No, they were important musically, but they were also social activists. So I thought that would be the sort of the perfect, bring full circle this musical journey through different genres and through different important social movements, cultural movements of Mexican music.
Which is a way to tell a story of not only music, but also events, historical events connected to the moments where music has been influential into the social experience of people in Mexico and in the United States that have connections with Mexico through identity or migration. But at the same time, it is an interesting way to show how many more connections exist, because when we talk about previous iterations of programming with Victory Players, particularly talking about Puerto Rico, with music composed by Puerto Rican composers and Puerto Rican residing in the United States. And there are so many similarities in understanding the meaning and having even almost equal experiences with the jukebox, La Rocola, which in Puerto Rico is called Bellonera. And that connection that may have a different selection of music, but many others are shared. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, creates a really strong way to continue this series of Victory Players with Puerto Rico, now Mexico, Mexican-American composers. And Rocola, I think, is the perfect way to connect all these identities and all these histories through the concept of the piece, but also the representation of the music and everything that comes with it.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about Hispanidad, or the Latinx experience, and it becomes really important, I think, once you move or once you find yourself in the United States, and we share not only a language, but we share many aspects of culture, including colonization, including resistance, resilience, all these migration, discrimination. So these are all shared experiences, so that are also connected, I think, culturally and musically. And then, we can also talk about Mexico as being part of the Caribbean. Veracruz, a really strong musical part of Mexico, and needless to say, other parts of the Caribbean. And that connection with Cuba and Puerto Rico. And it's a feedback loop. So music that originates in Cuba and Puerto Rico influences Mexican music, and then it goes back to Cuba and Puerto Rico through the radio in the 30s and the 40s, con la XCW, XCW, that then morphs into Televisa, which is the great television conglomerate, and in Univision and all the Spanish-speaking channels that are dominant, but that are mostly Mexican productions. And so, and a big part of that is music, the music of Agustín Lara, the music of so many, but also Héctor Lavoe being heard in Mexico, also Celia Cruz from Tito Puente, Pérez Prado, so Pérez Prado, who is a Cuban but Mexican and Spanish, so we share that culture, and I think I think there was an idea of a Pan-American music or a Pan-American connection. I think it's always it's been a project from that dates back to the independence movements throughout Latin America. And even though we have our differences, I think our similarities are stronger. And I am not sure that that Pan-American dream is intact or that it's the way that it was conceived, but there is, I think the Pan-American, the larger Pan-American culture is now being rooted in the United States, where we have so many Argentinian, Brasileños, every nation represented, and now sort of we speak about ourselves as Latinx.
And with this, the representation of history, identity, and culture through your music is being now performed by the Victory Players. And I would like to know how it has been the reception of your piece and also their feedback, particularly about how certain ways of performing, especially talking about cumbia and ska, when talk about art music or concert music is not necessarily something that is common. How has been this process of helping the Victory Players to understand better the way of performing rocola?
No, it's been a fascinating project. So this is the second year in the process. And so we've, it's a beautiful process of exploration and a lot of dialogue. We're also talking a lot about traditional Mexican music and playing a lot of examples that date back to pre-colonial times, through a lot of popular styles from indigenous cultures, and then mestizo music, onto boleros, and just a rich history, and just listening and giving them a context, a historical context and a social context for this music, for all these musical styles. And we've actually played some traditional music as well, so that we have it in our bodies. And then we go back to the classical pieces, and then we try to find those influences in the scores and try to bring them out. So it's been a great process of exploration. I like to say that the score just gets you so far, but then you have to work hard at getting the music out of the score and really bringing it to life and tell the story. So we spend a lot of time talking about, I spend a lot of time talking about my personal story and how my personal story is part of a larger story, of a larger social movement and a larger social moment in time. And so I try to communicate that and find examples that are analogous so that we can find common ground and bring the expression out of the music.
In a way, your piece, Rocola, is another way to document and capture this moment in time where we are seeing so many social activity and a way of representing in a positive way through this concept, si se puede, yes we can. And you were actually an essential part of the creation of this concept. So how did this happen?
Right, So when Tian, we started to have conversations with Tian about this project, and we were looking for a title, and so initially we were thinking about doing something or having a discussion around belonging, around immigration, and it's an important discussion. But when we think about the connection between Mexico and the United States, what we think about is migrant stories, especially now that there's a militarization of the border, when it's being used for political gain. But that is not new. There's a long history of politicization of migrants in this country. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, they just started mass deportations of Mexican Americans included. They didn't care that they had passports. If you looked Mexican, you were deported because it was a way to gain votes and to use that as a political tool in the middle of the Great Depression. In the 40s, the US soldiers, the mostly white Caucasian soldiers, were being shipped overseas, and suddenly there's no mano de obra, there's no labor. Someone needs to operate the factories and work the crops and make that work. So they brought the Bracero program. Thousands of migrant workers came legally from Mexico into the United States, often coerced, and often poorly treated and abused. And suddenly there's a culture, thousands of new migrants, which are then demonized in the 50s, or as our culture becomes more and more present, then it's not politically correct, and so we start back with pushing back and deportations and all this, and but really our Mexico and the United States, we have an unbreakable bond. I can't think of a single person in Mexico that doesn't have family in the United States. It's just the way that this relationship has organically worked. And we bring a lot of culture. We bring a lot to this country as well. So we talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really it's diversity, equity, and belonging. We belong here. These spaces. We belong in these spaces. We are going to take these spaces. We don't need to ask permission. We are here, and we are here to tell our stories and to be represented in every aspect of society.
So how do you feel seeing that a message so strong as Si Se Puede and the representation of identity, memories, and your personal story through Rocola creates a new way to document life in the second decade of the years 2000 through the sound of exploring history, Mexican identity in concert music, and at the same time giving a message to the communities of Hispanic identity in the United States to know that sí se puede, yes we can.
Yeah, so when we were talking about what to do with the project, we also didn't want to make assumptions of how people feel about belonging, about migration, about who they are, about their ancestry. It's very complex. So we sort of shied away a little bit from that. Not to say that it's not a big part of who we are, but we didn't want to make that the focus. And so we landed on this idea of Si Se Puede, which is our rallying cry that originates with Dolores Huerta in Los Angeles as part of the Campesino movement and with Cesar Chavez and this movement to unionize and to demand fair labor practices for all the day workers and for all the agricultural workers who were largely Mexican. And then that rallying cry makes its way back into Mexico. And in the 90s and the 2000s, it becomes a football chant, a rallying cry to push the Mexican soccer team into victory. And then from there, it takes into the streets. So we were also chanting Si Se Puede in the middle of the Zapatista rallies and in the middle of the great social transformations of the 2000s. And then it comes back into the United States as former President Obama takes it back and uses it as his campaign slogan. But the origin is Mexican. It's Mexican American. So it really felt fitting that would be the title for this collaboration, this binational or multicultural collaboration.
How it has been for you to be able to share not only your music and work with the Victory Players here in Holyoke, but also to share and enlighten people about your knowledge about Mexican music, and for them to discover there is so much more, even in things that may not be connected directly with what they listen to today on their regular platforms for it, but also the music that belongs to their ancestors as close as their parents or grandparents, the music they used to listen, and how much that has also a history that belongs to them and that they belong to.
Yeah, I mean, we have such a rich tradition, I mean, throughout Latin America, but very concretely in Mexico, especially concert music. You know, we have Mexican Baroque, wonderful Mexican Baroque composers, classical composers. We talk about Juventino Rosas, who wrote Viennese waltzes and polkas, you know, an indigenous man. And concert music in the 20th century, Moncayo, Blas Galindo, Revueltas, you know, there's a long tradition that is uninterrupted actually since the 1600s. And we are part of that tradition. And it's not only classical or concert music, but, you know, popular music, which is also a multicultural experience, and that tells, you know, music tells the story of people. It's not only about, even if it doesn't concretely in the words tells you a story, the fact that it exists is reflecting a culture, it's reflecting a movement, it's reflecting a moment in time. So I like to think a lot about windows and mirrors. You know, sometimes we play music that belongs to another culture, like Beethoven or Mozart, and it's a window into that time, into that space, into that culture. And sometimes we play music that is a mirror, that it reflects who we are. And it's important to have both. And it's important, you know, to recognize that what is a mirror for some is a window for others. And that if we just look at it that way, we will have a far richer experience. When we think about, you know, universities, conservatories, colleges, you know, we represent about 40%. The Latinx population in this country represent about close to 40% of the college-age population, and that number is going to grow. And in the music conservatories, in the music schools, we are not playing nearly enough examples of Latinx music or African American music, for that matter. So that paradigm needs to change, because we need to serve these communities. So it is important. You know, it's a need to serve the communities that are here and that are part of our social fabric.
So Jorge, thank you so much for being here, bringing your music, and also sharing with our community the piece that you have created, and with hopes that this continues germinating and inspiring more to continue appreciating and making amazing music, as this legacy of history since colonization started in Latin America is something good that we need to continue cultivating and having, because sí se puede.
Yes, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you and our audience. Y un saludo a la raza, y yeah, sí se puede. Yes, we can do great things.